Welcome to our Shelter Fundamentals online training. I'm Sarah Babcock, Chief Administrative Assistant for Jefferson Parish President's Office. And today we're going to give you a quick run through of Shelter Fundamentals for anyone who might be volunteering or working within a shelter in Jefferson Parish. Today's course is a condensed version of the training that we give in person to all new staff. However, this training is meant to be a refresher course on an annual basis, or if you have not had the full in-person training and there's an event coming up that you need to prepare for. So this course is based off of the American Red Cross Shelter Fundamentals so that we will be able to seamlessly integrate with the Red Cross or other state agencies that may be working with us. The purpose of today's course is to prepare you for the roles and responsibilities that you will perform in an emergency shelter and to provide you with an overview of tasks you might perform while you're there. This is the basic shelter course for everyone who may work inside a Jefferson Parish shelter. And there's additional courses you may be provided at a later date regarding more specialized roles. Our learning objectives for today is to explain the principles of sheltering, identify client needs, describe the different types of shelters, identify how a shelter is structured and operates, explain the activities and tasks that take place within the shelter, and explain the type of work that you would be doing. So now we're going to get into Unit 1, our introduction. A shelter is a temporary, safe, and comforting place for residents during a disaster or emergency. It is intended to be a haven in which people have a place to regroup and determine what the next steps of their recovery will be, and making sure that clients within the shelter are able to connect with all of the community resources they need. Here in Jefferson Parish, we take a client-first approach to sheltering. So when we talk about sheltering, it's not always about the facilities, processes, or rules, but making sure that we're supporting the people who need our help. It's important to remember that people staying in a shelter are some of our most vulnerable residents. They don't have another place to go. They don't have friends or family that they can stay with right now. They may not have the funding to stay in a hotel or be able to evacuate on their own. So we need to make sure we show each person compassion, make sure they feel important, and connect them with the right services. We want to understand and meet their needs, and our goal is to move people out of the shelter into a new location for their recovery. We also want to make sure that everyone is welcome in our shelters. The shelter is geared towards people who have been directly impacted by the disaster, not people who have lost housing due to other circumstances. And we should have staff on site who can redirect people as needed. We want to make sure that we are assisting everyone, regardless of race, color, national origin, religion, gender identity, age, disability, sexual orientation, citizenship, veteran status, and pre-disaster housing situations. There will be circumstances in which we have people who are homeless, for example, in our shelters. We also must accommodate people with access and functional needs. That includes visual hearing impairments and people with pets. Our requirement to assist those individuals actually comes from guidelines from FEMA. There are some circumstances in where someone may not be eligible for our shelter based on their medical needs. In this circumstance, we would relocate them to a medical special needs shelter or a hospital. Sex offenders may also be relocated to another shelter if that's available. When we end a shelter, we want it to be so successful that our clients say, I was able to access the shelter and all the services it provided. My immediate needs were met, and I received services where and when I needed them. I felt safe, secure, and comfortable. I'm treated with dignity and respect, and I'm able to stay with the people I came with. I feel enabled and supported to make the best decisions for myself and my family. and I understand how to receive care for my animal. I can connect with family and friends. I have the information I need to begin my recovery, and I'm connected to community resources. We also want our shelters to be successful for our workers and our staff and our volunteers. And so we want to be able to say at the end of a shelter that I treated all clients and fellow workers with dignity and respect. I felt safe, secure, and comfortable. I understood the mission and the program services. I understand the needs and priorities of my clients. I have the training, resources, and information I need to help our clients and community members. I'm empowered to make decisions, meet people's immediate needs, and help them begin recovery. I understand the reporting structure and how to get my questions answered and how to request supports. I had an effective supervisor who helps me do my job. My work is appreciated and my needs are addressed, and that I was able to expand my sheltering abilities, felt integral to the mission, and want to support sheltering operations in the future. So Unit 2, we're going to cover what shelters look like and how they are organized. There's a number of reasons that we would open an emergency shelter. This could be fires, storms, hurricanes, could be a tornado. It also could be short-term things, like a chemical accident where for a number of hours people can't be in their homes. Or it could be for extreme temperatures and people who may not have homes or have adequate heating or cooling. Here in Louisiana, there's a number of types of shelters that I want people to be aware of. The first category you see here is shelter categories. These are some national categories. Evacuation or respite centers would be those short-term places that people can go, likely not spend, a night, may just spend a few hours there. Congregate shelters refer to a shelter where people are staying in one large room, such as a convention center or a gym. Non-congregate shelters are when we open hotels or dormitories for people to stay where they're separated from other families. And a staff shelter is a shelter that we open for our own staff who need a place to sleep. There's also disaster recovery centers and family assistance centers that often look similar to a shelter, but people would not be sleeping over in these circumstances. And often these are for people to access community resources or to receive financial assistance. In Louisiana, when we talk about hurricane evacuations for Jefferson Parish, we talk about people going to a critical transportation need shelter. That's anyone who evacuates with the parish assisted evacuation program. There's also drive-up shelters for people who have their own car but need a place to stay. Medical special needs shelters are unique to Louisiana, where we are able to have full nursing support staff for people with very serious medical needs who need full-time nursing care. And finally, a sex offender shelter that is run by the Department of Corrections. Congregate shelters are what we see most often here in Jefferson Parish, and these may be in a variety of settings, such as recreation centers, community centers, churches, schools, etc. Most of the time, shelters in Jefferson Parish will be set up in JPRD facilities. The shelter itself will have a number of areas designated inside of it, even if it's primarily one large room. There'll be a lobby right inside the front door that provides reception, registration, and general information. There'll be a dormitory. This is the area with cots where people will sleep and live throughout their time there. There'll be a dining area where people eat meals, get snacks, and keep food outside of dormitory areas. An area for recreation. This could be an outdoor area for kids or a place where there's a television, books, or games to keep people entertained while they're in the shelter. We want to make sure that shelter staff have their own separate space, so some sort of an office needs to be identified where there can be team meetings, referrals take place, or address concerns and discuss in a quiet place. There'll be an area to administer basic health services. There may also be government services or social services present in the shelter, so they will need space to operate. Typically, this is only done during daytime hours. You may need storage for client belongings. Maybe a client has gone to the hospital and we need to keep their belongings safe for a day or two until they return. There will also be extra supplies within the shelter that need to be stored safely. It's also important that we have adequate toilets and showers for all of the residents within the shelter. Ideally, these would be inside the building, but there may be times where we use portable units outdoors. And finally, an outside area is extremely helpful, both a playground for children, but also a place where people can smoke if needed, and an area for people to sit. It's important for people to have a sense of normalcy and understand normal 24-hour cycle, and so it's important that they're getting adequate amounts of daylight. Shelter workers will be divided into a number of categories. Every shelter will have a shelter manager who is the one person designated as being in charge of that site. If we're in an extremely large shelter, there might be other levels of supervisors, including shift supervisors or functional area supervisors that would oversee reception, registration, the dormitory, feeding, health services, case management, and logistics. We also will have security at the shelter. This may be a variety of agencies. We would have ambulance support in some circumstances. If we're accepting pets, JPAWS would provide support with pets. And then we have specialized types of workers, such as mental health professionals, spiritual care, a shelter resident transition team, casework, support groups, and other types of logistics. Here in Jefferson Parish, we have a wide variety of agencies that help support our shelters. Our Parks and Rec Department, Office of Community Development, JeffCap, the library, JPAWS, Transit, and Emergency Management. We also have external partners such as the American Red Cross, Jefferson Parish Human Services Authority, the Louisiana Department of Children and Family Services, the Louisiana Department of Health, Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, and East Jeff and West Jeff Emergency Medical Services. All of these agencies come together to do their part to make our shelters work well together. Now we're going to move on to Unit 3, which covers shelters phases and the type of work that shelter workers would complete. It's important that we have realistic expectations for shelterees and staff. This current slide directly comes from the Louisiana United Sheltering Plan, which clearly outlines that our goal within the first 2 days of an incident is to provide life safety measures inside a shelter. This includes food, typically MREs, shelter and a roof over your head, and basic first aid. From 2 to 5 days, we transition into a life-sustaining mission where we are also able to provide people with cots, blankets, hygiene care, and access to showers, and more intense medical care. After 5 days, we move to shelter stabilization, which includes access to information, activities, and beginning to talk about a housing transition. It's important that we keep these expectations and are able to relay these back to our shelter residents so that they have realistic expectations of what it is like to stay inside the shelter. There are 3 phases of sheltering: opening, operating, and closing. Each phase has slightly different tasks that supervisors will assign and assist workers in completing. So our opening phase starts with setup. The Emergency Operations Center will determine which shelters are going to be opened, and then supervisors and the shelter manager will help determine where each activity will be located within that site. So when you arrive to assist with setup, you may be assigned to unloading and unpacking supplies, setting up tables, chairs, and desks, maybe setting up the specific locations within the shelter for reception, feeding, entertainment, etc. You may assemble and locate cots and make sure they're in the correct place. You might be posting signs and determining if there's areas within the shelter that need to be locked or barricaded off for staff only. We also want to make sure that there are no ADA compliance issues. Look for things like trip and fall hazards. Make sure bathrooms are free from anything that might get in someone's way if they are in a wheelchair. And we want to make sure that we are not blocking any emergency exits. This slide shows you an example of a typical dormitory setup. It's important to know that we want only one entrance and exit for shelterees and visitors. We want to make sure that that is a secure location so that unwanted guests are not able to enter from other places. Aisles between cots should always be 3 foot wide to accommodate wheelchairs. We do have privacy screens which can be put up for medical procedures, for someone who's bedbound and might need to get changed or need other assistance or use a commode. But we want to make sure that we take those down when they're not in use so that we can see all shelteries at all times. It's also important that people get enough square footage. For short periods of time, such as pre-hurricane, we would allocate 20 square foot per person. Anyone with a medical special need at all times should receive 100 square feet per person to accommodate their medical equipment. And if we're in a shelter for a long period of time, like post-storm hurricane, or if we have an infectious disease such as COVID-19, we would want to allow 60 square feet per person. Here are some of the typical tasks when we get to the operating phase. You could be working in reception, the dormitory registration, food service, interacting with clients, collecting and reporting information, providing information to clients, moving and inventorying supplies, and cleaning the shelter. There's a lot of information we need to gather while we're in the shelter, and much of that needs to be reported up to the EOC. This will help us provide excellent client service, maintain the operations, and make sure that you have all the supplies on hand that you need. When we enter the closing phase, we begin to break down these activities. This may happen all at one time, or it may stretch out over a period of time. But breaking down, you may be asked to pack supplies and equipment, fold tables, chairs, and desks, remove shelter signs, disable, clean, and pack up cots, and do a cleanup of the facility. Next, we'll move on to Unit 4, carrying out tasks within the shelter functions. When you arrive to work in a shelter, you should receive a job induction and assignment. During this job induction, you would learn about the shelter site, discuss your skills and strengths, be assigned to a specific workstation, receive the work assignment and a job action sheet, exchange contact information or be assigned a radio with the other staff, and establish a work schedule. While you may be assigned to one specific task, there's always something to do. During downtimes, it's important to help out your colleagues with other tasks and interact with the clients. Client interaction is where you will gain information that's critical for moving people along the stages of their recovery. If you're ever in doubt, please ask your supervisor. You're not expected to know everything about the shelter operations or the overall emergency response. Supervisors are there to help you, and you can always contact the EOC for more information. We want to make sure that difficult issues and decisions are referred to supervisors immediately. The reception area is one of the most important places in our shelter and is located by the front door. If you're asked to work in the reception area, there are a number of things that you will do, including control physical access to the shelter, direct clients to registration and answer questions, and sign in and out staff, visitors, media, and registered dormitory clients. Reception may be on its own, and it may be combined with registration depending on the size of the shelter, number of clients, and number of staff. We want to make sure that we maintain a space for people to wait in seats if there's a backlog at reception or registration. You also may need a space for triage to determine if anyone with medical special needs is more appropriate for a different type of shelter or needs to be redirected to a hospital. And there should be signage in the reception area posted by the supervisor. As I mentioned, there's a number of people who come into the reception area. You'll be given clear guidelines on how to handle clients seeking shelter, clients seeking information but don't need to stay in the shelter and need to be redirected, staff and volunteers, partner agencies, people who are coming to volunteer or help make donations will be redirected in an appropriate way, and other members of the public who may be coming to look for a family member. There'll be specific guidelines at your reception table to show you what to do in each of these circumstances. There's other people who you may need a supervisor to assist you with. This includes public officials, law enforcement, media, individuals seeking others, and unaccompanied minors. We have specific ways of handling this, but it's important to get a supervisor or shelter manager to assist you. The reception area will also be responsible for checking out individuals as they leave our shelter. And there are a few rules. If anyone is gone from the shelter for 48 hours without a predetermined reason, such as, a hospital stay, they will not be allowed to enter back into the shelter. If anyone is arrested while at the shelter, they will not be allowed back in. If someone leaves for medical or mental health reasons, or something is worked out with the shelter manager, we may keep their space and their belongings until they return. Triage is an important part of the shelter to ensure there aren't any immediate medical needs and that people are redirected to a hospital or medical special needs shelter if necessary. Triage should be completed by a nurse or other medical provider when possible. Sometimes we may co-locate people with medical special needs into a general population shelter. In this case, the triage nurse will determine which area of the shelter the person should be in. In situations where there is a separate medical special needs shelter, the triage nurse will coordinate transportation to that shelter if needed. The triage is done using the Louisiana Department of Health shelter triage form. If you're assigned to dormitory registration, you will assist clients who are entering the shelter fill out the shelter dormitory registration form. Once they have filled that out, you will assign them to a cot and make sure they get settled. Within the first few hours of a client being there, you will also begin work on the discharge planning form. This form is multiple pages that's meant to be done over time and slowly provides us with more and more information to get the client the services they need. Initially, you'll ask some basic questions about food allergies, medical needs, and any needs of infants or young children so that we can meet their basic needs within the shelter. Over time, you'll then start to gather more and more information that will help us determine a long-term housing solution for the clients. The dormitory registration team will often also make referrals for clients to other organizations. It's important that as staff and we gather information about our clients that we protect their privacy. We want to make sure we're keeping personal information and forms away from other clients. We don't want to speak too loudly or find places to speak confidentiality, and watch for others who might be listening. We do not allow any unauthorized person to view records, and do not reveal whether specific clients are present in the shelter. Please get a supervisor if someone is looking to identify a client. If you're assigned to working in the dormitory, our goal is to keep it a safe, secure, and sanitary place. We want to make sure that this is a closed space to unauthorized persons and that our residents' privacy is protected. We want to make sure that there are entrance and exit controls and sleeping areas are monitored, especially at night. We want to enforce rules about no eating in the dormitory, no smoking, vaping, alcohol, illegal drugs, or weapons are allowed in the shelter. We want to make sure aisles are clear and not blocked, watch out for hazards and any dangerous behavior. We also want to make sure that we have important signs in the dormitory, posting directions to services. We want a daily schedule that includes our lights out and quiet hours, post information about meals, shelter rules, schedule, and information. We also want to make sure we keep it clean and sanitary. We also want to make sure that no one is being abused or neglected within our shelter. Often these are times where we identify whether it's a child or elderly adult that may be being neglected by a family member, domestic violence, or other human trafficking. Please report it to your supervisor immediately. Most importantly, when you're working in the dormitory, you'll be interacting with clients, asking how they're doing, asking what they need, helping them get from referrals, meet with different client service agencies. We also want to pay attention for clients who may not be eating, seem distressed, ill, or need something else. We want to make sure that we're not have some illness spreading through the shelter and make sure that we're addressing mental health needs. Client interactions help us learn about our clients' needs, encourage them and raise morale, get them thinking about their next steps, and learning what we can do to make their stay in the shelter better. Next, we're going to talk about feeding. There's 3 feeding areas in each shelter: the snack and beverage table, the serving area, and the dining area. We want to make sure that we clean and sanitize feeding and dining surfaces before and after meals. We want to wash and disinfect hands and wear gloves and hairnets if we're serving food. We want to make sure that we've replenished snacks and drinks, and we may help serve meals as well. If someone has a specific dietary need, we need to report it to the EOC. Every day, we will order meals for the following 24-hour period. And so it's important that by 10 a.m. every morning, we have an accurate head count of the number of shelterees and specific dietary needs someone has. As a Jefferson Parish shelter, there are some specific state rules that we have to follow. The first is that the food the parish provides to shelter clients must be prepared by a LDH licensed facility, and therefore the parish maintains contracts with local partners and restaurants to provide the food. As shelter staff, we may not accept food from community members or community groups without prior approval. All food must be eaten in the designated area outside of the dorm. This is to ensure that we do not have bugs or other critters. We also want to make sure that all food is served is kept at the appropriate temperature in order to reduce illness. There may be some circumstances in which a bedridden individual does have approval from medical staff to eat at their cot. We want to keep snacks, water, and coffee available at all times for shelterees and our staff. Shelterees are allowed to obtain their own food and bring their own food into the shelter as long as they store it and eat it within the designated area. Food and medications should be stored in separate refrigerators, and all prepared food should not sit out for longer than 4 hours. Sometimes a shelter will have an information area. This will help us answer questions and find referrals and resources that you might not know about. So this may be a bulletin board, it may be a table or another area of the shelter where you are able to list locations of services offered within the shelter and those available in the community. It may also help with reunification, and there needs to be a place where shelterees can go to with problems or complaints. There may also be computers or telephones or other devices that are provided for clients in order to obtain information. Most people who work in the shelter will have to help with shelter supplies. In a large shelter, there may be a designated logistics team. This would include unloading and storing supplies, unpacking supplies, moving them to where they need to be, and completing the shelter inventory form to keep track of how many supplies we are using. It's really important to keep our shelter clean. Often, illness, particularly diarrheal diseases, are common in shelters. It's important that floors get swept daily, including under cots. Restrooms need to be cleaned at least twice per day, and that may be increased if an illness begins to spread within the shelter. Kitchens, food prep areas, and serving areas should be cleaned after each meal. Doorknobs, tables, and other commonly touched surfaces should also be cleaned regularly. Both staff and shelterees can participate in the cleaning process and should be given tasks around the shelter. In addition to our generic shelter workers, we may have specialized teams, including health services, mental health, spiritual care, child care, discharge planners, housing and social service providers, and pet services. You may be asked to assist any one of these groups. Medical services within our shelter will include first aid and medical administration. This could include refilling prescriptions and helping to coordinate the pickup from pharmacies. It could be coordinating dialysis or other types of medical appointments and transportation. Within the medical services, they will also complete the LDH surveillance report on a daily basis to report up any illnesses that may be found within the shelter. They may also coordinate a contract for personal care attendants who are able to provide support to individuals within the shelter who need assistance getting dressed, going to the bathroom, eating, etc. Medical services may also provide care and medical monitoring for medical special needs clients if we have to co-locate these individuals within the shelter. All clients within a shelter have gone through a disaster and may have experienced trauma. It's also likely that some residents are suffering from mental health or behavioral health issues that existed prior to the disaster. It's recommended that all shelter staff and volunteers take training in psychological first aid, but mental health providers will also be available to help provide counseling, refill prescriptions, or admit into treatment services. There are some situations in which we may need to have spiritual care on site. This may be particularly necessary if there are missing or deceased family members. It may also occur that a shelter is open on a day of the week in which spiritual gatherings are common, like Sundays, or that it's over a holiday, such as Christmas or Easter. If these things occur, it'll be important for us to set up services led by local spiritual leaders. It is possible that we can also set up some basic child care in a child-friendly spaces area. The goal of this child care within the shelter is not for parents to leave the shelter without their children, but instead create a place for children to play with staff while parents are able to complete other tasks within the shelter, such as signing up for housing services. These spaces can keep children occupied, help them get back into natural routines, give them a chance to play, or help them work through their feelings through art. Any staff that run these operations should have completed the Save the Children Child-Friendly Spaces training. Discharge planning is the most important part of a shelter. Our goal from the moment someone enters the shelter should be to have a place for them to go so that we can close the shelter down. Sometimes residents will be able to move back into their home where they were living before the storm, but many times there may need to be multiple steps of temporary housing, including hotels or short-term rentals, before they're able to return home. Discharge planning forms should be completed on every client once they've entered the shelter and should be updated over time as plans change. This information should be shared with housing and social service agencies. Housing and social service agencies are an important part of the shelter to help connect people with resources and aid in their recovery. Often, people need assistance securing IDs, social security cards, birth certificates, finding new apartments or hotels, completing housing applications, completing SNAP or DSNAP benefit applications, and transportation. We may also set up a MAST, or multi-agency shelter transition team, that can be created to hold daily case conference meetings to coordinate the transition of everyone out of the shelter and into other housing. Service animals must always be allowed to stay in every shelter setting with their owner. Pets may be accommodated in the shelter in a variety of ways. The first is an off-site pet shelter where residents would be transported on a daily basis to care for their pets. We may also have a co-located pet shelter where pet shelter and person shelter is located at the same facility, or a cohabitated shelter where pets are able to stay right at the cot of their owner. No matter what the circumstance is, owners must be able to take care of their pets and keep them under control. JPAWS will provide supplies, kennels, and leashes, and also treat pets for fleas and ensure they're up to date on vaccinations. It's also important that pets have a consistent type of food because changing brands can often lead to diarrheal disease, which is important to avoid in a shelter setting. This is the end of our shelter training. As we mentioned, this is a brief high-level overview of the in-person class that we offer. We hope this provided you with the basic information you will need to feel comfortable entering a shelter. There are additional recommended trainings for people that we have created, including shelter management, CPR and first aid, psychological first aid, identifying medical and mental health needs, child-friendly spaces, maternal and infant support, pet support for evacuation and shelters. In addition, we will complete annual trainings and exercises to address identified needs by our staff each year. We hope you learned something and are ready to support in a shelter. Thank you.